All right, golfers. So today I actually want to dive into a little more detail on the grip and the wrist angles that we have throughout the golf swing. Now, first things first, despite what certain magazines or videos out there might be telling you, the reality is not everybody needs to grip the club the exact same way. So the positioning of our hands on the club is not necessarily an absolute for every single player, and it doesn't need to be consistent. What does need to be consistent in order to give you a chance at hitting some good shots is to find the right pairing between the positioning of our hands on the club and the wrist angles that we have in the golf swing between flexion and extension. And this is what we're going to go over in this video, is diving into a little more detail on the matchups that work and those that don't. Now, we are not talking about the pressure of how tight we're holding the club, but more so about the rotational positions of each hand. So when we're talking about strong, what we mean is that both hands are rotated significantly towards the trail side of the body in the setup. Meaning for a right-handed player, what we mean is that the hands are rotated very strongly to the right. So the lead hand, so that's the left hand for the righty, is going to be rotated very much on top of the handle like this. This is considered a very, very strong grip. The trail hand would be to the side, almost even underneath. So if you see a player holding the club something like this, that is considered very, very strong. When they are kind of in between that extreme and the other, that's what we call neutral. So when the line between the index finger and the thumb is pointing relatively towards the middle of our chest, something like this here, that would be considered more of a neutral grip. So you'll see that position, something like this. And weak would be the opposite, meaning the hands are rotated significantly towards the lead side. So the left hand for the righty is very much underneath the handle. The trail hand is very much on top of the handle. This would be an extreme case of a golfer with a very weak grip. Now, before we get into the matchups, I want to talk about what flexion and extension on the wrist angles do as an influence to the club face. So just to give you an idea, regardless of where the grip is, the more the lead wrist moves into flexion in the golf swing, meaning the more you take the lead hand, so that's the left hand for the righty, and you start to curl it inwards where the knuckles of the hand are hinging underneath the forearm like this. So they call that flexed or bowed. That movement alone will influence the club face more closed. No matter where the club face is, no matter where the grip is, if I start to create a lot of flexion on this wrist, I am going to close the club face. So if I have a flat wrist angle at this point here and the club face looks like it's in a certain position, and I start to create a lot of flexion to that wrist, the club face is going to start to close on me. The opposite can be said for extension, meaning if you start to hinge the knuckles above the forearm like this, so they call that extended or cupped, that movement will influence the club face open. Regardless of what the grip looks like, regardless of where the club face is at that point, it will start to get more open than it is. Meaning, again, if the club face is at a certain position, and let's say I'm actually in flexion here and the club face looks like it's at a certain angle, if I start to cup the wrist or extend it like this, you're going to see the club face open up. So if the club face is at a certain position because my wrist is flat at the top, if that wrist angle was actually an extension, the club face would be more open. These are things that are important to be aware of when we're talking about the wrist angle's influence on the club face. Now, when we're talking about strong grips, they always work better with extended lead wrists, and it's because of how the hands are preset on the club. When I take a very, very strong grip where my hands are rotated towards the trail side of my body in the setup here, when the club face is square, what you're going to notice is that my lead wrist is very, very cupped at this point. And we know that moving the wrist towards flexion will close the club face. Well, if I'm preset in a cup position and my club face is already square, I can't necessarily afford with a very strong grip to get the wrist into too much flexion. My club face is going to be so close, I have no chance from here, right? How can I hit a functional shot from here unless I make some sort of body compensation through the golf ball? So when you have such a strong grip here in your setup, you don't need to get the wrist angles into a flat spot. You need to keep them relatively cupped. That way, when you're coming down, the club face can be somewhat square with this type of wrist angle. If you do somehow get the wrist into flexion with a very strong grip, your club face is going to be so close, you don't have a chance. You're likely going to hit a lot of hooks. So keep this in mind when you're thinking about matchups. So the opposite can be said for weak grips, right? I'm going to show you an extreme case here, but because my hands are going to be rotated significantly towards the lead side, what you're going to see in the setup when the club face is square is that my lead wrist here is already in some level of a flat position. So I actually need to carry a weaker grip with more flexion on the lead wrist to make sure the club face doesn't open up too much because of how my hands are preset on the club. So you don't need to always have the same grip. You just need to match it with the appropriate wrist angles. If my weak grip starts getting into a lot of extension, a lot of cupping, my club face is going to be so open here. The only way to square this up at the bottom is by either early releasing it or flipping the forearms. So when you have a weak grip, that's totally fine too. Just make sure that you carry it with a lot of lead wrist flexion, a lot of bowing on that left hand if you're a righty, to make sure that the club face stays square so that we don't struggle with slices. If you start to get cupped with the weak grip, you have no chance here. Obviously, the club face is going to be so open, you're likely going to struggle with a lot of curvature to the outside. Now, the one that is most commonly taught and the one that people consider ideal would be the neutral grip position. This is the one I haven't mentioned yet. So for those of you who don't know what that looks like, it's when the hands are not overly rotated towards the lead or the trail side in the setup, kind of right in between the two patterns where the index finger and the thumb, the line between them is pointing somewhat at the middle of your chest. Now, the reason this is neutral for starters is because when the club face is square in your setup, your wrist angles will likely be relatively flat on a neutral grip. That's where the neutrality comes in. And this is easiest as a grip to figure out where the club face is because proportionally speaking, whatever amount of flexion I get into on the wrist angle, because I started flat with the face square, when I flex the wrist, obviously the club face is going to get closed relative to that. If I extend the wrist, the club face is going to be open. So total neutrality would be the ideal with this type of matchup. A flat wrist with a neutral grip works well. Now, is this the only grip players need to play with? Absolutely not. At the end of the day, like I said, there are a wide range of matchups that work. The important thing is finding the combination between them.